In Chapter 7, we're going to begin what is my favorite part of physiology, which is discussing the nervous system. First things first, you can divide the nervous system into two parts. There's what's called the central nervous system and what's called the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. That's the entirety of the central nervous system. It sounds like I'm minimizing it by saying that, because the central nervous system is the most complex portion of the entire body, but that's what makes up the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. What makes up the peripheral nervous system is everything that exists outside of the central nervous system. Okay? Everything that's part of the nervous system that's outside of the central nervous system is called the peripheral nervous system. Everything highlighted in blue here, all these little lines, make up what's known as the peripheral nervous system. Now, what the peripheral nervous system really is what are called nerves. Nerves make up the peripheral nervous system. Now, we're going to talk about both these portions of the nervous system in a lot more detail, obviously, as we progress throughout this chapter as well as other chapters. But for the moment, what we're going to focus on is the nerves. We're going to focus on the peripheral nervous system. First things first, a nerve and a neuron are not the same thing. A neuron and a nerve are entirely different. Okay? Here's the difference. What you're looking at here are neurons, right? They're two neurons. We're going to look at those, there's the structure of them shortly, but those are neurons. Neurons are what you find in nerves, okay? You can also call neurons nerve cells if you want to, but I also don't love that term, but regardless, inside of a nerve, you find neurons. Particularly, you find what are called the axons of neurons, but that's neither here nor there for the moment. Okay. What I'm about to do is show you some terms. It's called efferent and afferent, which stands for motor and sensory. And those terms get assigned to neurons, not nerves. Let me try to explain that right now. What you will find traveling throughout these nerves in blue are neurons. Inside of those nerves, there are neurons. Okay? And the neurons inside of those nerves can be one of two things, one of two categories. They can either be afferent, which stands also for sensory. The two terms mean the same thing. Or the neurons inside of those nerves can be efferent, which can also be called motor. Okay. These are the two different classes of neurons within nerves. Neurons within nerves can either be afferent or sensory, or efferent or motor. Okay. So let's start off by talking about what an afferent or sensory neuron is. From this point on, I'm going to use the term sensory. Sometimes my brain is going to flip back and forth, and I'm going to say afferent again, because I just can't control myself, because I use these two words so frequently that it's hard for me to strictly stick with one. But I'm going to try to stick with the term sensory. But please know that sensory also means afferent. Okay? So we're going to start off by talking about what are called sensory neurons, and then we'll go on to talking about what are called efferent or motor neurons, and I'll try to stick with the term motor. So, what is a sensory neuron? A sensory neuron is a neuron that sends information. We'll talk about the organization of how the neuron exists within the nerve later on in the semester, but For now, you don't need to know that to understand this part. A sensory neuron, what it does is it sends information from the periphery of your body, like your skin, for example, back to the central nervous system. Okay? The neuron exists within the nerve, and its job is to send information from the periphery of your body towards the central nervous system. Okay? By periphery, that can mean many, many things, some of which are hard to explain right now. But periphery could be within an organ like the heart, or the lungs, or the skin. I mean, you pick something peripherally located on your body. The job of the sensory neuron is going to be to send information from that location through a nerve back to the central nervous system. Imagine the things that you can sense within your skin. Heat, pressure, touch, vibration, pain, all those sort of sensations that you can have within your skin, those are actually products of sensory neurons. They pick those things up. Ultimately, our brain generates those sensations, as you're going to see, but it's the sensory neurons that initiate the process of having that sensation. Something happens within your skin, like you push your hand on a table. What that's going to do is it's going to generate pressure on your skin and on your body. And the sensory neurons are going to pick up that sensation ultimately of what's ultimately going to result in the sensation of pressure. And they're going to send that information from your skin, from the periphery of your body, towards the central nervous system. And then the central nervous system is ultimately going to be what allows you to have that perception of pressure. We'll get to all of that later on. For now, we can just say, what do sensory neurons do? They send information from the periphery of your body towards the central nervous system. You can't really call something a sensory or afferent nerve. There are a couple examples of nerves that only have sensory neurons within them, like the optic nerve, for example, but there's very, very, very few of those. The vast majority of nerves throughout the nervous system, throughout the peripheral nervous system, have both what are called sensory and motor, as you're about to see in a moment, neurons within them. So you can't call a nerve a sensory or afferent nerve. It really doesn't make any sense. What you can say is that there are sensory neurons within that nerve that send information, of course, from the periphery of your body towards the central nervous system. That is the only way it really makes sense on a definitional level. Okay, so moving on to motor. A motor neuron. What does a motor neuron do? It's the opposite of a sensory neuron. A motor neuron sends information from the central nervous system, right, through a nerve out to the periphery of your body. Right? It sends information in the opposite direction. That's what motor neurons or efferent neurons do. They send information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. What is the periphery? The periphery could be a skeletal muscle fiber. It could be, again, your heart. It could be your lungs. It could be so many things peripherally located in your body. That's what motor neurons do. They send information from the central nervous system outwards towards the periphery. And here's the thing. Within any given nerve, right, there's a lot of nerves in the human body. You're going to find both motor and sensory neurons traveling through those nerves. Both. They're mixed. That's what most nerves in your body are, mixed nerves. That means both motor and sensory neurons travel through them. That means some of the neurons in the nerve are sensory, meaning they, let's change the color, send information from the periphery towards the central nervous system. And some of the neurons in that exact same nerve are motor. They send information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. Now here's the thing. Sensory neurons are pretty much sensory neurons. There are technically two classes of sensory neurons, but in a course like this, we're really not going to get into any meaningful difference between those two classes. And there's to try and define a true difference between the two, I think is a little bit challenging. So sensory neurons, for the sake of this course, are sensory neurons. They send information from the periphery towards the central nervous system. That's what they do. We're not going to get into different classes of sensory neurons. We're just going to say sensory neurons are sensory neurons. However, when we talk about motor neurons, we absolutely can make different classes and talk about different classes of motor neurons. Not all motor neurons are created equal. There are differences between the different types of motor neurons. So let's talk about that. So you have this big class of motor neurons. Send information from the central nervous system through a nerve out towards the periphery. But then what you can do is you can say, well, motor neurons can either be somatic or they can be autonomic. Auto. Right? Motor neurons can either be somatic or autonomic. What does that mean exactly? A somatic motor neuron is a motor neuron that we have conscious control over, meaning that you have the conscious ability to determine when this motor neuron is going to generate what's known as an action potential, an electrical impulse, and pass that information off to the periphery. This is a little bit hard to explain right now, but somatic motor neurons, all of them, go to the skeletal muscle fibers within your skeletal muscles. Okay. We've got millions and millions of somatic motor neurons, and all of them go to our skeletal muscles. They attach to the skeletal muscle fibers within our skeletal muscles. Let me explain what I mean by that. Okay. We can consciously determine when we want to contract a muscle. If I told you right now to contract your biceps muscle and produce elbow flexion, assuming somebody doesn't have some neurological problem or some sort of illness, everybody can do this. It's because of the fact that we have conscious control over when what are called these somatic motor neurons generate action potentials. You can make a conscious decision to contract your biceps muscle and produce elbow flexion. Let's do this a little differently. Okay, so first of all, a motor neuron, right, sends information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. That's what all motor neurons do. All right. Some of them are what are called somatic. We have conscious control over them. We have conscious control over when they generate electrical impulses, and they use those electrical impulses to pass the information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. All right. They all go to skeletal muscle fibers within skeletal muscles. Okay, so my biceps muscle is a skeletal muscle. There are muscle fibers, skeletal muscle fibers within this biceps muscle of mine. And what travels out to it are these somatic motor neurons, right? Motor neurons that we have conscious control over. And then you say, well, give an actual example of what that means. I have the conscious ability to control when these motor neurons, somatic motor neurons, generate electrical impulses and thus cause my biceps muscle fibers to contract. To give an example of that, I can make the conscious decision right now that I want to contract my biceps muscle, fibers within it, and produce elbow flexion 3 times. I just told you I was going to do that, and I can do it. I mean, it might seem obvious that anybody is capable of doing this, but why are they capable of doing it? So let's go ahead and do it, right? 1, 2, 3. Right? I just made the conscious decision to contract muscle fibers within this biceps muscle and produce elbow flexion 3 times. How? Because the motor neurons that travel out to the muscle fibers within my biceps muscle, I have conscious control over, right? I determine consciously when these neurons, these motor neurons, generate electrical impulses. And I can say to myself, I want these muscle fibers within my biceps muscle to contract 3 times to produce elbow flexion 3 times. And this is why we have conscious control over the skeletal muscles within our body, right? Because all the skeletal muscles, again, more particularly the fibers within the skeletal muscles, but all of the skeletal muscles have these motor neurons called somatic motor neurons that travel out to them. And we have the conscious ability to control when these motor neurons generate electrical impulses. That's why we call them somatic. And thus, we have conscious control over when all of the skeletal muscles in our body actually contract. That probably shouldn't make complete sense at this point, but I think it will once we get through the entirety of the nervous system and then skeletal muscle. I hope that video wasn't entirely useless and actually provided some context to this conversation. So motor neurons, right, they send information from the central nervous system outward through a nerve, and if we have conscious control over them, we call them somatic. These somatic motor neurons that we have conscious control over travel out to the muscle fibers within our skeletal muscles. And that is the reason that we have conscious control over human movement. Because the neurons that travel out to our skeletal muscle fibers, we have conscious control over, and thus we have conscious control over when our skeletal muscle contracts, and that allows us to control movement. All right. Next category of motor neuron is autonomic. And autonomic should give you an idea of what these are. These are motor neurons too, right? They send information from the central nervous system through a nerve out towards the periphery, but we don't have conscious control over them. We don't have any control over when these neurons generate electrical impulses and pass information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. That's why they're given the term autonomic. Now, unfortunately, you have to categorize autonomic motor neurons into 2 more categories, because autonomic motor neurons can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic. Let's take a closer look at this. Okay. So if a neuron sends information from the central nervous system through a nerve out towards the periphery, it's motor. If we don't have conscious control over it, it's autonomic. Okay? Fires without our conscious thought. Now, 2 categories. It can be sympathetic, first of all. No one would do this, but for the sake of being complete, we can call these sympathetic autonomic motor neurons. Nobody would do that. Again, they would just call them sympathetic neurons, but for the sake of learning, why don't we do that? First of all, what makes something a sympathetic autonomic motor neuron? Well, if you look and you go through each term, motor means it sends information from the central nervous system outward. Autonomic means we don't have conscious control over it. And sympathetic means that it is a autonomic motor neuron that activates the fight or flight system. Okay, it activates fight or flight, which means these are the neurons that are going to cause heart rate to rise, blood pressure to increase, breathing rate to increase, digestion to slow down. These are the neurons that kind of activate the body to engage in physical activity, to either run away or fight something. I know I mentioned this briefly before, actually, with the endocrine system and epinephrine, but that's actually a little different than this conversation right now. Epinephrine is part of this pathway too, but it's a hormone and quite different than what's happening here. It'll all make more sense, as the semester progresses. You just have to believe me when I say these things come together one piece at a time, and now is not that time. Anyways, okay, these are the autonomic motor neurons that activate the flight or fight system in our body. Okay? We call them sympathetic autonomic motor neurons. Most people would just say sympathetic neurons, and they'd assume that you know the other two things. So that's one category of autonomic motor neuron, sympathetic. The other category is what's called parasympathetic. Parasympathetic autonomic motor neuron. Okay, let's think about what that means. If we were to do this in its entirety, we would say parasympathetic autonomic motor neuron. Okay, it's a motor neuron. It sends information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery. Great. It's autonomic, so we don't have conscious control over it, and it's parasympathetic. That would imply that this is a category of autonomic motor neuron that activates the rest and digest system. It's going to do the complete opposite of the sympathetic, right? These neurons, these autonomic motor neurons, are going to cause heart rate to decrease, blood pressure to fall, breathing rate to go down. It's going to cause digestion to increase, right? It's going to prepare you for relaxation, let's say, a period of time when you're not physically engaged. This is the other category of autonomic motor neuron. Okay. When we talk about some people will just say autonomic nervous system. What they're doing, and they're talking about the autonomic nervous system, they're talking about motor neurons. Now, there are some sensory neurons that may be part of this, some people would categorize as well, but mostly when people are talking about the autonomic nervous system, they're talking about motor neurons that we don't have conscious control over that are either sympathetic or parasympathetic. They either activate the fight or flight system or they activate the rest and digest system. So let's do this as a whole. The peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves. Inside of those nerves, there are neurons. Neurons can be categorized into two categories. They can either be sensory, meaning they send information from the periphery through a nerve back towards the central nervous system. Sensory. Or they can be motor. If they're motor, they do the opposite. They send information from the central nervous system through a nerve out towards the periphery. So those are your two categories of neurons. Sensory neurons are sensory neurons, but motor neurons we can categorize, we can subcategorize. Motor neurons we either have conscious control over and go to our skeletal muscle fibers. We call those motor neurons that we have conscious control over somatic. If we don't have conscious control over those motor neurons, we call them autonomic. Okay? That's all the difference between these two motor neurons are. If we have conscious control over them, they're somatic. If we don't have conscious control over them, they're autonomic. Now, autonomic neurons, motor neurons, we can subcategorize again. Autonomic motor neurons can either be sympathetic or parasympathetic. If the autonomic motor neuron is sympathetic, it activates the fight or flight system. If the autonomic motor neuron is parasympathetic, it activates the rest and digest system. And there is your basic introduction to the nervous system. This is directly from your textbook. What is it showing? It's showing efferent or motor neurons, and it's showing afferent or sensory neurons, right? It's showing the efferent or motor neurons sending information from the central nervous system out towards the periphery, and it's showing the sensory or afferent neuron sending information from the periphery towards the central nervous system. This is also directly out of your textbook, and what it's doing is it's categorizing the different types of neurons within our nerves. Exactly what I just did with you. Okay, here are the afferent, otherwise known as sensory neurons. Yeah, it gives technically 3 different categories of those, but they're really all very, very similar. I would never ask you to know that on an exam. I just want you to know what a sensory or afferent neuron is. Okay, and here it's showing the efferent or motor neurons, and it is categorizing them into all the categories that I showed you. Okay, so I hope when you look at images like this in the text, you can have an idea of what's actually being depicted now. So here we finally now get to talk about those neurons that I've been talking about so much. Here is an image of two different neurons. We're going to go through the basic anatomy of a neuron. I know that those of you that have taken anatomy have done this already, but it's necessary for us to do this again because we are going to go through the intricate physiology of all these different portions of a neuron. And you got to know what they are, first of all. So this is, first of all, what's called the soma, or the cell body of a neuron. Okay. By the way, one more time, there's two neurons depicted in this image. Okay. The soma of the cell body, or the soma or the cell body, excuse me, is where you find the nucleus and all the organelles of a neuron. So you're going to find the smooth and rough endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus, all that kind of stuff within the soma or the cell body. All right. So what comes off of the soma or the cell body is the important part. I don't care that you necessarily know what the soma is for this class, but I do want you to know what comes off of the soma are what are called dendrites. Those are all dendrites depicted in the image. And what dendrites do is they actually receive information. They receive electrical information, as you're going to see. And what they do with that electrical information is they actually send it into the soma and then down into a place that we call the axon hillock, or hillock, depending upon who you speak to and what language. What is the axon hillock? It's the beginning of the axon. Every neuron, there's one category of neuron that people might argue about this with, but every neuron really has one axon that comes off of it. The axon is one very long projection that comes off of the neuron. And the axon hillock is the beginning of that axon, that one long projection that every neuron has. So, first of all, I need to say this. The dendrites, again, are what receive information. There would be many, many more than 4 dendrites on a neuron. There'd be thousands in reality, right? This isn't drawn to scale. This is just to give you a basic idea of what neurons do. But there are thousands, typically, of dendrites that come off of the cell body or the soma of a neuron. And what those dendrites do is they're going to receive information and they're going to send that information towards the beginning. Let's erase some of this. They're going to send that information, this electrical information, towards the beginning of the axon called the axon hillock. And what the axon hillock will do is it will determine whether that information, we'll call it a stimulus if you like, whether that information or that stimulus is strong enough or sufficient enough to generate this big electrical impulse that's called an action potential. An action potential is a strong, what's called non-decremental, we'll get into all that, electrical wave that travels down the axon. Okay. The information that the dendrites are receiving and sending towards the axon hillock is the information that the axon hillock uses to determine whether or not one of these action potentials needs to be generated or will be generated. And let's just say that the information coming from the dendrites to the axon hillock is sufficient. It's good enough. And the axon hillock doesn't really decide, as you're going to see very shortly, but it decides that the information from the dendrites is sufficient and we need to generate one of these action potentials. And that's what happens. One of these action potentials, these strong electrical waves, non-decremental electrical waves, will now travel down the axon, that one very long projection located on every neuron. And what you need to see now is at the end of the axon, it branches many times. In this image, it's showing it only branching a few times. In reality, if you look at a neuron and you look at its axon, it'll branch typically thousands of times. Okay? None of this is drawn to scale. This neuron only branches, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. Okay? It would branch many, many, many more times than this actually in the human body. We call each one of these branches an axon terminal. These are all axon terminals. The axon branches into axon terminals. So if that strong electrical wave, called an action potential, is traveling down the axon, then it's also going to enter into all of these axon terminals, all of these branches, because they're all extensions of the axon. And that's exactly what happens. That electrical impulse travels into all of these axon terminals and enters in to the end of them. Because at the end of each axon terminal, it swells. So let's talk about that. If you look closely, you can see at the end of each axon terminal, there's a swelling that occurs. Those are called axon terminal buttons or boutons. It would look like this. Here's an axon terminal, and at the end, it swells. Okay? That swelling at the end of the axon terminal is called the axon terminal button or bouton. Depends again on the text and the person and the language. So why do we have a swelling there? Well, because what you find inside of that button are vesicles. I know you know what vesicles are because we talked about those. And inside of those vesicles, you're going to find chemical messengers. Usually, these chemical messengers are what are called neurotransmitters. Sometimes, as you've seen, they can also be called hormones. It all depends upon what the chemical messenger does. Does it just travel through the interstitial fluid and bind to another cell, or does it travel into the bloodstream? Usually these, let's just say statistically speaking, throughout the nervous system, usually the chemical messengers inside of these vesicles are neurotransmitters. Sometimes, depending upon the neuron, like if it's located in the hypothalamus in that one region, these could be hormones, but usually these are neurotransmitters. Anyways, the point is that electrical impulse travels down the axon terminal into the axon terminal button, and that's where the electrical impulse does its job. The purpose of this electrical impulse, again, called an action potential, the purpose of the action potential is to travel down the axon into the axon terminals, into the axon terminal buttons, and that action potential, which is a strong electrical impulse, what it does is it triggers exocytosis of these neurotransmitters, again, occasionally hormones, within these axon terminal buttons. The vesicles will go to the distal end of the button, dock, and then release the chemical messenger, which is usually a neurotransmitter. That's the purpose of the action potential, this strong electrical wave that travels down the axon. It's to cause exocytosis of what are usually neurotransmitters. So, what would we say about like if you're going to generalize, because that's what we've been doing. I've said the dendrites of a neuron receive information. They send the information towards the axon hillock. The job of the hillock is to determine, based upon that information, that stimulus, whether an action potential needs to be generated or not. And then if it's strong enough, an action potential will be generated. An action potential travels down the axon into the axon terminals and into the axon terminal buttons. So what could we say then about the axon terminal buttons? What's the job of the axon terminal buttons? The job is to pass the information to something else. That's what the axon terminal buttons of a neuron do. They pass the information to something else using the chemical messenger that's usually a neurotransmitter. That's how these axon terminal buttons pass information to other things. They use to other cells, right? They use neurotransmitters to do so. And the purpose of this big electrical wave traveling down the axon, called an action potential, is to ultimately allow for these axon terminal buttons to pass that information to something else, because the action potential triggers the exocytosis of what are usually neurotransmitters, occasionally hormones. You're not going to find a neuron, by the way, that has both neurotransmitters and hormones. That's not how things work. Each neuron is only going to have one type of neurotransmitter within it, one type of hormone, depending upon where it's located in the body. But that's the basic anatomy of a neuron in what it does. And now let's briefly talk about how one neuron would communicate with another one. So let's say that this neuron here, neuron number 1, right, its dendrites received information. They passed the information towards the hillock, the beginning of the axon, and the hillock said, that's a sufficient amount of information, that's a sufficient stimulus, let's generate an action potential. An action potential is this strong electrical wave that travels down the axon, the one long projection of neuron number 1. That action potential spreads into the axon terminals and thus into the axon terminal buttons. And what does it do to the axon terminal buttons? It tells the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 1 to pass the information to something else. It does that by triggering exocytosis of what are typically neurotransmitters within the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 1. That's what the action potential does. Okay, typically, statistically speaking, one neuron is usually going to pass the information to another neuron, and that's what's being depicted in this image. Here's neuron number 2. Okay, well, let's think about, again, like elementary anatomy of this. The purpose of axon terminal buttons of a neuron is to pass the information. Okay, now let's think of another neuron. Where must the other neuron, let's say neuron number 2, hook up with neuron number 1? And the answer is, well, which portion of a neuron receives information? The dendrites. So that must mean the dendrites of neuron number 2 must hook up with the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 1. This is what's going to, where the dendrites of one neuron meet the axon terminal buttons of another neuron is ultimately going to be called the synapse. We'll look at that shortly as well. But this ultimately has to make sense, right? If one neuron is going to pass information to another neuron, then you just have to think about the anatomy of the two neurons, right? The two neurons have to meet where one neuron passes information and the other neuron receives information. That means two neurons must meet at the level of the axon terminal buttons of one neuron and the dendrites of the other neuron. And that's exactly what's being depicted here. Right? These two neurons, neuron number 1 and neuron number 2, are communicating with each other. If you want them to communicate with each other, then you need the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 1, which pass information, to hook up with the dendrites of neuron number 2, which receive information. So what's going to happen? The axon terminal buttons of neuron number 1 are going to pass information to the dendrites of neuron number 2, and the dendrites of neuron number 2 are going to receive that information. And ultimately, you can tell that this is done through neurotransmitters. There's a lot more to go to make sense of all of this, but there's the basics of it. Right? Neuron number 2 receives information from neuron number 1. And what does it do with that information? The dendrites send that information, which is ultimately electrical impulses, towards its axon hillock. So the dendrites of neuron number 2 receive the information and send that information towards the axon hillock, of course, of neuron number 2. And then what does the axon hillock of neuron number 2 do? It determines whether that information, that stimulus, is sufficient enough or not to generate this big electrical impulse that we call an action potential. And let's pretend that it is. So the axon hillock of neuron number 2 sees that that information or that stimulus is sufficient enough, and it generates what's called this action potential, this big electrical wave that travels down its axon. So now neuron number 2 is sending an action potential down its axon, and that action potential is going to spread into what? The axon terminals of neuron number 2, and then into the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 2. And what's that action potential going to result in, right? It's going to cause the release of what are usually neurotransmitters from the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 2. Right? It's going to cause exocytosis to occur, right? Those vesicles within the axon terminal buttons that have chemical messengers within them are going to go to the plasma membrane, dock on the plasma membrane, and release those chemical messengers, typically neurotransmitters, into the interstitial fluid. By the way, why would we say that the chemical messengers released by neuron number 1 are neurotransmitters? Well, clearly, they're released by a neuron, right? It's a chemical messenger released by a neuron. It travels a very short distance through the interstitial fluid, and then it binds to another cell. By that, I mean the dendrites of neuron number 2. So we would call that a neurotransmitter, right? That's how we define the chemical messenger that is a neurotransmitter. Okay, so neuron number 1 passed its information to neuron number 2 using neurotransmitters. Now, neuron number 2, due to the action potential that it generated, released neurotransmitters as well. And where do you think that these neurotransmitters are going to go? Well, statistically speaking, the axon terminal buttons of neuron number 2 probably hook up with, otherwise called synapse, with the dendrites of another neuron that we might call neuron number 3. That would be the most statistically likely scenario. And what would neuron number 2 do? It would, of course, pass the information using neurotransmitters from its axon terminal buttons to the dendrites of neuron number 3. The dendrites would receive that information, send it towards the hillock, and then neuron number 3 could potentially generate one of these action potentials as well. Now, the axon terminal buttons of a neuron, most of the time, just again, statistically speaking, attach to the dendrites of another neuron. But sometimes, as I've already mentioned, the axon terminal buttons of a neuron might synapse, by that I mean attach to, like a skeletal muscle fiber. Sometimes the axon terminal buttons of a neuron can actually attach to, synapse with a cardiac muscle fiber, somewhere out in the periphery of the body. Sometimes the last neuron in line in a motor pathway will synapse with, attach to, meaning its axon terminal buttons hook up with, some cell out in the periphery of your body. But usually, to get to that point, you need like 20 neurons, maybe many more, to actually communicate with each other to actually get to the last one that then finally attaches or synapses with that cell out in the body. And then those neurotransmitters would actually pass information to like a skeletal muscle fiber, for example, rather than another neuron. What I just said there, yet again, doesn't need to make perfect sense right now, because I'm just setting you up to explain ultimately that later on. And I think in the circumstance where you actually see like how neurons in the brain ultimately end up passing information to multiple other neurons, which then finally pass that information to a skeletal muscle fiber, when you see that in a diagram, I think it'll make a lot of sense when we get to that point. For the moment, all I wanted to show you was the basics of a neuron's anatomy and the basics of how a neuron works and passes information to something else. So there are technically 3 different categories of neurons. The one that we're going to talk about the most is this one, but we're still going to mention what the other 2 are. Okay? The names multipolar, pseudo-unipolar, and bipolar come from the number of projections that come off of the cell body. Okay? If more than 2 projections come off of the cell body, the neuron's called multipolar. That's the one we've been talking about. Right, here's the cell body or the soma. It's got a ton of projections that come off of the cell body, and the axon is included in this count, by the way. So multipolar neurons, I mean, you can see there's 7 projections that come off of the cell body, which is many more than 2. So this would be called a multipolar neuron. In reality, in the human body, multipolar neurons have thousands of projections that come off of them. So let's skip over one and now go to a bipolar neuron. A bipolar neuron gets its name because it has 2 projections that come off of the cell body. Now that might confuse you, and you'd say, there's only one dendrite? And technically, there's only one dendrite that enters into the cell body. But if you actually take a closer look at the dendrite, there's thousands still of dendrites. Just what happens is all of those dendrites merge together into one projection, and that then one projection enters into the cell body. And then on the opposite end, there's the axon. So bipolar neurons, yeah, there's technically only 2 projections that come off of the cell body, but in reality, there's still thousands of dendrites. It's just that all the dendrites merge together into a singular projection before entering into the cell body. And then on the opposite end, again, there's the axon. So if you look at a bipolar neuron, there's 2 projections. One projection is a dendrite, and one projection is an axon. And that brings us to the most confusing one, which is pseudo-unipolar. Now, some people just call these unipolar neurons. What that means is you have a cell body and one projection coming off of the cell body. Okay, but it's a little more confusing than that. What a pseudo-unipolar neuron is. Okay. First of all, it is true that pseudo-unipolar neurons only have one projection that comes off of the cell body, so you can call them unipolar. But the reason that they're called pseudo-unipolar is because they actually develop initially as bipolar neurons. Pseudo-unipolar neurons earlier on in their life were bipolar neurons. And the axon, I shouldn't say the axon, the cell body kind of changes its location to create this circumstance. Look at this bipolar neuron. If you were to just move the cell body over and allow for the dendrite and the axon to connect to each other, you would create a pseudo-unipolar neuron. That's exactly what happens. Over time, during development, the pseudo-unipolar neurons start off as bipolar neurons, and the dendrite, that singular projection, and the axon actually merge together, and the cell body moves over. And you create a neuron that actually technically only has one projection. But it's called pseudo-unipolar because throughout the lifespan, this is not a unipolar neuron. It actually starts off as a bipolar neuron and then just changes its orientation a little bit to become a pseudo-unipolar neuron, or let's say a neuron that has only one projection, but at one point in its life had 2 projections. So calling it or naming it becomes a little bit difficult. Scientists have somewhat struggled with how to define pseudo-unipolar neurons. And the reason is because look at this. All the dendrites merge together into one projection. Now, that one projection that all of the dendrites merge together to form doesn't actually officially enter into the cell body by itself. It's continuous with the axon. So the question becomes, do you call this portion where all the dendrites merge together, do you call that a dendrite, or do you call that an axon? Because that part where the dendrites all merge together to form this singular projection is actually continuous with the axon of the neuron. So ultimately what you'll see with pseudo-unipolar neurons is they call this entire projection, starting from here all the way down to here, including the axon terminals, but they call this entire thing, that entire projection, the axon. Where the dendrites all merge together to form this singular projection, as soon as all the dendrites merge together to form that singular projection, that goes immediately to being called the axon. because the one very long projection that comes off of the cell body of a neuron has to be called the axon. So since this entire structure is continuous, scientists have decided to call this entire thing the axon. This projection, to be called a dendrite, would have to enter into the cell body by itself, and it doesn't. It's continuous with the axon, so it's referred to the whole thing as an axon. Pseudo-unipolar neurons still have dendrites, but technically those dendrites merge together straight into the axon rather than the cell body. I'm not going to ask you intricate questions on the exam about pseudo-unipolar neurons. Okay? If anything comes up on the exam about pseudo-unipolar neurons, they're neurons that have a cell body that only has one projection that comes off of them. They're called pseudo-unipolar because at one point in their lifespan they were actually bipolar. Pseudo means looks like something but kind of isn't something at the same time. Basically, they're just a very confusing type of neuron. Don't stress about knowing the details of a pseudo-unipolar neuron, I guess is what I'm telling you. The main one that you're going to see throughout the semester is this. Basically, 100% of the time, you're going to see multipolar neurons and not these other two. They're a lot less common when you're discussing. It's a lot less common to discuss pseudo-unipolar and bipolar neurons when you're discussing more, let's say, intermediate physiology. So I've got some terms here for you. In the central nervous system, if there's a group of axons that are all together, it's referred to as a tract. Tracts run up and down the spinal cord. What that means is there's groups of axons all together that run up and down the spinal cord. They're in the brain too, and they're referred to as tracts. You probably learned about some of these in anatomy if you took anatomy. Not something we're going to do a lot of in this course, but it's still a term worth knowing. Now, in the central nervous system, again, either the brain or the spinal cord, this is mostly going to happen in the brain. If you have a group of cell bodies all together, it's referred to as a nucleus. You see this term in the brain quite a bit. If there's a group of cell bodies of neurons that are all clustered together, it's referred to as a nucleus. Okay, what about the peripheral nervous system? When you're inside of the peripheral nervous system, this one shouldn't be all that surprising, and you have a group of axons that are all together, it's referred to as a nerve, right? The peripheral nervous system is made up of nerves, right? And inside of a nerve, right, it's made up of a whole bunch of neuron axons. That's what a nerve is. Now, don't let this part confuse you because it makes it seem like it's a separate part of the peripheral nervous system, but it's not. Inside of a nerve, actually, if you have a group of cell bodies that are all together, that's referred to as a ganglion. Ganglions are inside of nerves. So I guess you can't say that nerves are explicitly just axons of neurons all traveling together, even though that's mostly how they're thought of. But if you see this a lot. This happens at every level of the spinal cord, actually. Outside of the spinal cord, I have to say that differently. This happens within every nerve, I should say, that attaches to the spinal cord. Inside of that nerve, you'll find these what are called root ganglions. It's actually part of the nerve, but it's a portion of the nerve where there's a whole bunch of cell bodies all clustered together. Anyways, these are just some terms for you in case you see them come up at one point or another. You have an idea of what they mean. And the last thing before we end this lecture is to mention that many axons of neurons are lined with something called myelin sheath. Here's an axon, right? And this axon is lined with myelin sheath. It's showing the progression of myelin sheath, starting here and moving all the way over to here. This is what it looks like when it's finished. What myelin sheath is it's first of all, it's a fat. Myelin sheath is a fat, and it's wrapped continuously around the axon. That's what myelin sheath is. It's literally a fatty wrapping around the axon. And many axons within the central and peripheral nervous system are myelinated, is what it's called. What that means is they have myelin sheath around their axons. So if you come down here, this is actually showing, right, a multipolar neuron that's myelinated. You can see each one of these is a section of myelin sheath. And you'll notice that there's a little gap. How about I do that in red? There's a little gap that exists between each section of myelin sheath. That's called the nodes of Ranvier, which is going to become very important later on, not so much right now, but you do want to probably make note of the fact that the myelin sheath isn't just continuous down the entire axon. There's actually sections of it, and there's gaps in between each section of myelin sheath. All right, so one other thing, briefly, this is really an anatomy topic, but in the central nervous system, the cell that creates myelin sheath is what's called an oligodendrocyte. The oligodendrocyte is the cell in the central nervous system that creates myelin sheath. And you can see that it actually creates myelin sheath around multiple different axons. Right? These are 3 different axons. And this oligodendrocyte is creating 3 different sections of myelin sheath around 3 different axons. That's a big difference you're going to see between the oligodendrocytes and what are called the Schwann cells, which are located in the peripheral nervous system. So in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells are what create myelin sheath. In the central nervous system, it's the oligodendrocytes. And what's the big difference here? First of all, a Schwann cell only creates one section of myelin sheath around one axon. Okay? So each one of these is actually a Schwann cell, right? That's what happens in the peripheral nervous system. There are Schwann cells that create myelin sheath, and each one of them only creates one section of myelin sheath around one axon. And you compare that to the central nervous system, where you have oligodendrocytes that create myelin sheath. And they create multiple sections of myelin sheath around multiple different axons. At the end of the day, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells both create myelin sheath, one in the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes, and one in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells. But there are some differences between the two of them in terms of the number of myelin sheath that they can create. Now, what's the function of this myelin sheath? It's to allow those big electrical impulses that travel down the axon, called action potentials, to propagate a lot faster. When you have a neuron that's myelinated, has myelin sheath around its axon, it can propagate, spread action potentials at much, much faster rates than if the axon is what's called unmyelinated, doesn't have myelin sheath. And in the next section, and starting in the next lectures, we will start the beginning process of explaining action potentials and ultimately get to why this is the case.